goes off, just interrupt me and let me know. Hi, everybody. My name is Eiko Fried. I'll talk today about lack of theory building and testing in psychological science. The slides are online on the OSF. You can find them there. And yeah, thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm looking forward to giving the talk and to your discussion points later on. As Hans said already, I am sort of working in between applied psychology, mostly clinical psychology, and a bit of psychiatry and statistics, and going back and forth between sort of theoretical considerations and statistical modeling. The last years of my own work and also of the literature have given me a few headaches, and I've spent, I think, 6 years writing up a paper on these headaches. It's probably the longest I've spent thinking or grappling with an issue in my career so far. And this talk and the paper I will talk about today are sort of the result of these 6 years of grappling me with these problems. So I'll give a brief introduction to the problem that I see, or to the general issue that I see here. Then I will talk about 3 specific problems: conflating statistical and theoretical models, latent theories and weak theories. And then I will conclude with ways to fix everything, hopefully. The paper I will talk about today is online as a preprint and in press at Psychological Inquiry, and I'll get back to that at the end of the session. So here's a comic that I found on the internet, fantastic comic. Many of you might have seen that comic before, where a person whom I assume to be a researcher conducts research and is confronted with data, and the data says no, and then you can see the researcher being quite sad about that result. Let's talk about this comic in a bit more detail. Sorry, is anything unclear? All good? Okay. I'll go back to presenting then. Okay, so this is how I see the image. There's a theory, or a person has a theory, the data says no, and then we're left wondering what that means for our theory. Maybe our theory is rejected. I think there are 3 scenarios in psychology that we commonly face. These are the 3 problems I wanted to talk about today. So the first scenario is where it's sort of unclear how your theory relates to your data. In this case, the data cannot inform you. They cannot corroborate a theory. They cannot reject a theory. And what that means is that you're left wondering what you've learned about your theory from your data. I think that is actually quite common. But it's not the worst scenario. I think there are worse scenarios. The second scenario is one where our theories are latent. And with that, I mean, but they don't explicate them in detail. They don't tell us what the causal mechanisms are, what the theory actually says. And so when confronted with data, they can just claim that their theory is confirmed, but we have no proof or no way to corroborate that as independent researchers. The third case is a case of a weak theory. So now the theory is explicated, but it is a theory. It is explicated in such a weak fashion that it is unclear what the theory actually says in detail. And we've seen that a lot in social psychology in the last decade, possibly also before, where researchers have a theory that is not really explicated. Data tell us something, and then the researcher keeps their theory and they blame the mismatch of data with theory on something that is auxiliary, such as a hidden moderator. I'm sure all of you have seen that a lot. And I don't want to blame social psych specifically. Of course, this happens everywhere, but it has been mostly discussed in social psychology in the last decade, I would say. How it should be, and that's sort of also the conclusion of my talk, I will get back to later. I think data should tell us so we should have a close mapping between theory and data. And data should tell us to modify our theory. That's not a good or a bad thing. That's just how science works. And then we update our theory and we rinse and repeat. And there's no need to be sad in any of these 4 images. That's just how science works. We update our theory, we rinse, and we repeat. Okay, let's look at the last decade. And again, in the end, I will conclude with the next decade that is to come. in the last decade, we've become really good in psychology in identifying and preventing questionable research practices um, via specific tools. One of these tools is pre-registration, where we clearly register our hypothesis before we collect or analyze our data. Many people of you might know about open science, which I think is just the right way and the only way to do science. And we have multiple people on the call here today who are leading figures in this movement. Patrick Forscher is here, for example, who has been a huge inspiration to all of us when it comes to open science practices. Hans himself has done very, very well, has contributed to many large-scale projects, and has been an inspiration to me personally as well. For example, with the way he runs his lab. And I starting my new grant next year, I will copy many of the mechanisms Hans has in place for my own lab. So that's been positive, but the identified challenges and solutions have focused on improving the replicability of statistical findings, and that has focused on methodological practices. In my view, and in the best case, this leads to robust effects. That's not a bad thing, having more robust effects. But I don't think psychology is about finding effects. I think psychology is about explaining effects. So here's an example, and again, Patrick is here, and so are other people who have contributed to the PSA. This is a fantastic multi-lab study. It's pre-registered, it's a replication, it's of an important phenomenon, great study. But to be a devil's advocate here, all we learn from this is that there is a robust effect, or the absence of a robust effect. That doesn't explain anything by itself. And because effects require explaining, so we call an effect an explanandum, meaning it needs to be explained. These effects do not do the explaining, and that's called an explanans in philosophy of science. Cummins said that very well. It's an article I really recommend to everybody. In psychology, we are overwhelmed with things to explain and somewhat underwhelmed by things to explain them with. And of course, we need things to explain first before we can explain them with things. At least that's a perspective one can hold. Other people hold different perspectives, but we cannot stop there. That is not everything. This situation has led many to conclude that there is a crisis of theory. And a few years ago, when I started this project, reading up on the literature, I concluded myself that the theory glass in psychology is at the very best half empty. Okay, now let's go to the meat. Theories in psychology are usually about psychological constructs, and that is what I will focus on today. They are about things like personality traits, neuroticism. They're about cognitive abilities like intelligence, mental disorders like depression. And the idea is, or the general question is often, what are these constructs? And what is the relation between these constructs and the way we measure them? And that'll make more sense in a few minutes once I go through this. My own research has focused on mental illness, which is why I will focus on this in the presentation today. But if you folks work on personality or cognitive abilities, just think along with your own construct in mind, because this applies to your world as well, I think. So there are two basic ideas how measures relate to constructs. They're both wrong because they're too simplistic, but they're good ways to think about this and simplify the issue a little bit. So I'll do that today. The first is the common cause theory, where you have a psychological construct, the PC, that causes the observed scores. For example, for intelligence, we do an intelligence test. We have multiple questions. We add them up in some way, and these questions are thought to reflect the underlying ability intelligence. And so in the causal model, there would be causal arrows going from the construct, intelligence, to the tests of the construct, which would be questions, for example. Spearman, 1904, wrote a famous paper about the correlation of subtests of intelligence, showing that they're pretty high. And he interpreted what came out of these subtests correlations as a psychological construct. So he said, well, we can summarize this statistically, and I call that the G factor, which is a psychological construct, not a statistical construct. So it's a theoretical thing, not a statistical thing. That's a difference. in psychology, in clinical psychology, over the last decade, there has been a ton of literature on the P factor, P for psychopathology, which is the same idea, where at least some of the researchers have clearly explicated that they think it is a causal psychological construct that causes depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, personality disorders, and so forth broadly. So it's like the G factor in a sense. And other people, famous people in personality, have argued, McRae and Costa, for example, the very famous researchers known for their work on the Big Five, among others, have argued that these Big Five are underlying tendencies that cause and thus explain the patterns of thoughts, feelings, and actions that one sees. So again, there's a common cause, and it causes the answers on the questionnaire of extraversion, for example. I have this slide in here because people often say that the common cause theory is just a straw man. Nobody actually believes that. That is not true. The three most influential researchers in each of these areas have explicated this very clearly, that they believe that a common cause lies at the heart of what establishes this construct. Obviously, other people have other ideas. I'm not pretending everybody in these fields believe that, of course. Many people disagree, but it is a perspective that people have taken, and it's a prominent perspective. I will focus on the P factor today, again, simply because I'm a clinical guy, and that's what I know most about. The alternative theory, I think also falls, in its simplicity at least, is network theory, where you have the same data now, you observe correlations among items of intelligence, and you say, well, Eiko, these correlations, they don't come from a common cause. The correlations among these items come from mutual relations. So for intelligence, you would argue that answering the question, what is 2 + 2 correctly, causes you to answer the question, what is 4 × 4 correctly, which is probably absurd and incorrect. For depression, however, where these measures are symptoms, you would argue that the correlations of depression symptoms don't come from a common cause, but they come from the fact that insomnia causes fatigue, and fatigue causes you to sleep terribly because you're overtired, which causes you to have an argument with your partner, which causes you to ruminate, which causes you to have suicidal tendencies, and so forth. And in this world, it's probably not an absurd theory. It's quite plausible, I think. Again, this is an example. Think about your own theories in your own fields during the remainder of the talk, and sort of use it as a mental exercise to see how much of this applies to your field and your area. Now, network theorists who believe that depression is a system of variables that influence each other probably want to use network psychometrics, so statistical models from the world of complexity science to model these relationships. So in that sense, there's a relation between, on the left side, the theoretical model, and on the right side, the statistical model. And there's some models, I'm not going to go into details here, that you can use. And if you believe that the common cause causes your data theoretically, a good model to use is a factor model. I'm not saying it's the only model, but it is a reasonable model to use because the factor model represents the shared variance of your depression symptoms or your intelligence items as a latent variable, and you draw arrows from the latent variable to your measures. And there are some models that have been used. Confirmatory or exploratory factor models are the most common ones in psychology. Okay, so structural equation models generally, but I will talk about CFA mostly today because it's so commonly used. Now, after this, I needed to introduce these two models really quickly, and now I want to talk about the three big problems in detail, first in summary and then in detail. So the first problem is conflating theory and statistics. I truly believe that the word model has caused fairly considerable harm in psychological sciences because we use the term model for both theoretical model and statistical model. And it's often unclear to me what people talk about in their papers. And if I look at my own work, it is also unclear in my own work until a few years ago when I paid more attention to that. So if you have network theory and you use network models on your data, there's an inference gap between those. And you need to make sure that your model fits your theory to learn anything from your data. The same applies to common cause theory and factor models. I call it the inference gap, and I will talk about this in more details later. When your theories are unclear to me, when you hold your own little theories, but you don't tell the reader in your paper, it's unclear why you use statistical models in the first place, and it becomes then unclear what you can learn from your data and from your model, given that I don't know why you used the model in the first place. And third, if your theory is ambiguous or weak, it lacks guidance. It doesn't provide guidance for the use of an appropriate statistical model. And that means, again, we cannot really learn anything from the data regarding your specific theory, because the theory needs to guide what statistical model you use. If there's a mapping between your theoretical and your statistical model, that is where we can learn most. So we need to help data to bear on our theories. And that's challenging. I don't want to pretend that's easy today, but I think it is something we should think about more. All right, so let me get into the first issue here, conflating statistical and theoretical models. My favorite webcomic, poorly drawn lines. One guy says, I get confused a lot. Here's a picture of me being confused yesterday. And the other person says, that's not you. And then you can see this person being really confused. And that is me when grappling with the literature often. I get confused in what people mean with the term model. And yeah, I'll try to explain this in some detail now. So here's a quote. My paper and the talk feature many quotes from many researchers. I do this to explicate that there's a problem there. Because if I don't provide these quotes, people will say, yeah, Eiko, but you argue against a straw man. These issues don't exist. So here are some examples. I'm not calling out these people in specific or these authors in specific. I have written papers like that as well, where the inferences don't follow from the data because I didn't think about it thoroughly enough. I hope that doesn't happen to me again. And I hope in a scientific discourse, the authors of these papers will understand me calling them out for what I think doesn't follow. Doesn't mean they're bad folks, doesn't mean they're not good researchers. It just means that this particular quote in the context of that paper doesn't follow from the evidence, in my opinion. Okay, just as a disclaimer. So these authors here said they fit a p-factor model. So it's a factor model and it has the p-factor on top. And the authors, it's cross-sectional data, by the way. So it's just your data are people and symptoms, people and indicators. So two-dimensional data frame, common in cross-sectional data, rows and columns. And the authors say, research into the correlation structure gives evidence of an overarching factor that reflects an underlying liability to experience all forms of pathology. So I don't think that's true. I don't think you can gain, I don't think a correlation matrix can provide evidence of a psychological construct. I think it can provide evidence of a statistical construct. The rest is inference. I also don't think it follows from a correlation matrix that there's an underlying liability. That's an interpretation you can draw, but I don't think it follows from the data. And I also don't think that the replication of this p-factor underscores treatment, because for treatment is a causal process. For recommending treatment, we need to understand the causal process here. And the authors fit cross-sectional data argue that the p-factor is causing everything else, and we should intervene on the p-factor or on the other factors. But again, that doesn't follow from cross-sectional data for obvious reasons. The same applies to the network literature. Here's a network paper, again, cross-sectional data, and the authors say the items in the network that are most central, so that the most strongly connected items basically constitute the backbone of depression and sustain depressive symptoms. So sustain is sort of also a causal interpretation. It means they're the ones that's sending most of the signals. If you have those, you're more likely to stay depressed, and it doesn't follow from cross-sectional data. So we have a conflation of theory and statistics here. And it's an interesting conflation because while network theory and the common cause theory are competing, at least in their most basic form, both cannot be true at the same time. Either the correlation in your data comes from a construct, a common cause, or it comes from correlations or, causes among the items themselves. While those cannot be true at the same time, the statistical models will in many cases be perfectly equivalent. There's some more details I can't address. That's worth its own talk. So just for the sake of today's talk, we will consider them equivalent, and I will show you what I mean with that. So in statistics, there's a term we call statistical equivalence. And it means you can fit different models on the same data, and you get exactly the same fit. To prove this, I mean, it's widely known, but in this paper I showed briefly for readers who don't know the statistical literature too well. So I have one data set here that I make up. And I make up this data set from the left model. So I am God now. I determine the true model, which is the network model on the left side. And I simulate data from this network model. It's now a data set. And I fit the model on the right side to this data set, and the model fits perfectly. I can also do it the other way around. I determine the right model to be the true model. I simulate data from it, and I fit the network model to it. And again, I get perfect fit. This is a common scenario. Statistical equivalence is very common for models that we use in psychology. But that means that if I find a good fit of a network model or a good fit of a factor model, that tells me nothing whether a network theoretical process or a common cause theoretical process generated my data. It tells me nothing about the underlying mechanism for my data. So don't confuse the statistical model or fit with what generated your data, because the inference gap is too large. It does not follow. I hope that's clear. Sorry, I've been teaching for 4 hours this morning, teaching students, and so I always want to go back to chat and ask if my students understood everything correctly. But I just hope, for the sake of the talk, it's clear enough. Otherwise, we can talk about it after this talk in more detail. So the model fit tells us little to nothing about mechanisms that generated our data. In this case, there are other scenarios, of course, where model fit is more informative, but we can talk about them later. A well-fitting factor model cannot be taken as evidence that P or G or these sort of factors exist in the world as construct, or that it causes the data, and the same applies to network models. A well-fitting network model cannot tell us where we should intervene on the data or on the system, because for that to be true, the network model needs to be generated by a network model. If the network model is generated by a factor model, by a common cause model, then interventions in the system do nothing. So don't confuse these two aspects with each other. It's super common in the literature, and I think we need to get better in avoiding that. So again, the theories are competing with each other, but the models are equivalent, and that means there's little we can learn from these models about our theories, unfortunately, especially in cross-sectional data, which I would say are 98% of the data people fit models to in personality, in cognitive and clinical psychology, for the P factor, D factor, and sort of the big five and so forth. So going back to examples, it's very common in the literature to argue based on cross-sectional data that the P factor is supported, replicated, explains the data, or exists. So it's often unclear if they mean the statistical P factor or the theoretical P factor, which don't have different names in the literature, which is super confusing. So again, the statistical P factor arises necessarily every single time items are positively correlated. You always have that everywhere. It's tons of examples in the literature. Anytime your data feature a positive manifold, so they have positive correlations, you can fit a factor model and get a factor or a higher order factor with good fit. But it doesn't tell us anything about what generated the data. It always follows from the data structure. The theoretical P factor is a different thing. And the question is, what would that be? How would it look like? I don't know many theoretical papers about that, how we would establish it, what it means for interventions and so forth. The work so far has been primarily focused on the statistical P factor. A potential solution for nomenclature, at least, was provided by Ashley Watts, who said we refer to the general factor of psychopathology as the P factor when discussing it as substantive construct, so theory, and we call it the general factor when discussing it as a methods construct, so the statistical P factor. I think that's very helpful. And I think if you work on these sort of things, nomenclature helps a lot separating these for your readers. In the network literature, the same problems happen or occur. And I want to give you one example that is most common and concerns me a lot. So in my field, and I gave this talk to network theorists before, so I might need to explain this a bit better than on this slide. So network theory, at the heart of network theory are vicious cycles. So for example, on the right side here in this image, you can see many double arrows. And double arrows means, one symptom goes up and causes the other symptom to go up, and this symptom causes the first symptom to go up, and you are trapped in this loop of problems. And that's how many clinical psychologists understand mental illness. Vicious cycles of problems that are hard to escape. A common model in my field is called a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. And what DAGs do is that they cannot have feedback loops. DAGs are constrained so that if you start at a certain point in your graph, you can never, if you follow the arrows, you can never return to the point where you started. So DAG are directed, and starting at node A, you can never go back to node A because you cannot estimate that model using a DAG. And that's a fantastic mismatch between theory and model. Why would you use a DAG? Theory, there are many feedback loops that generate my data. It makes no sense. It's a mismatch between theory and model. And how do you want to bring your model to bear on your theory if you do that? The second point is a bit technical, and I think I'll skip that. I have a paper in the bottom left you can read on this, but many of the statistical models we use in the network literature are unable to retrieve processes predicted by network theory. And of course, this mismatch is a big problem. But I'm not going to spend more time on that. You can read up on that in a fantastic paper by Jonas Hasselbeck, Oisin Ryan, and Don Robineau. Okay, so problem one, results of statistical models are taken to corroborate theories, but that often ignores the inference gap. The most common shortcut is to interpret the statistical model as theoretical model, which is obviously invalid. And the most important point here is that these challenges hold irrespective of the quality of or the quantity of your data. If you have really perfectly measured data without measurement error, it doesn't help you. If you have very, very large samples, it doesn't help you. You cannot escape causal ideas and theory and model equivalence, statistical equivalence. It doesn't get better with larger data. It doesn't help. Maybe an example from the paper. So there's a paper, I forget the authors, but I have it in my preprint, who analyze a microchip, a very simple microprocessor, the one that's on every motherboard and in every phone. And they use this microprocessor, this microchip, using modern tools of neuroimaging. So they use the sort of most basic structural imaging software. And basically the result that they get is completely incorrect. So they learn the wrong things about this microprocessor, although it's the most simple microprocessor. And so the question arises, how can we bring our data, the microprocessor or the human brain, to bear in our theories to inform what we know about the world or what we want to know about the world if there's a fundamental mismatch here. I really like that paper. It was criticized quite heavily, I believe, by the neuroimaging literature. So I'm not an expert enough to sort of call any conclusion there, but I think it's worth reading and maybe also worth reading the commentaries. Right. Second problem. How are we doing with time? I'm half an hour in. Yeah, I'll hurry up a little, but I think the introduction, it's good to have a bit of a more detailed introduction for today. So problem 2 on latent theories and psychometric cakes. Most of the work in the factor modeling literature, but also the network modeling literature, follows the same standard baking recipes, again, including yours truly. And what this does is we fit fairly sophisticated statistical models on cross-sectional data. And then we report chi-square and RMSEA and modification indices. And it's sort of like a step-by-step to-do list. But it's entirely unclear at this stage how this informs theory. It's just fitting models to data and reporting statistics, fit indices. And maybe some of you say I'm exaggerating a little. I really don't think I am. I've read hundreds of papers fitting factor models to depression data. I'm entirely unclear what we learned from that. What does it mean when there are 3 factors in my depression data? How does it inform anything? I don't know. Same for network models. And of course, there are exceptions, and people have drawn conclusions, and people have informed inferences properly. But as a whole, the literature is just fitting models at this stage. And I don't think that helps us too much. And I think we need to think about theory a bit more. And I've been approached by many colleagues over the last years who said, hey, Eiko, do you want to collaborate with me? And then I said, on what? And they said, well, I want to fit a network model to this data set. And I said, but what do you want to know? What is your research question? Why do you want to fit a network model? And of course, we also have this in the factor modeling literature. And maybe I should put a disclaimer here. I think it's super important to describe data thoroughly. I think it's super important to do exploratory research. And if you read my paper, maybe you get the idea that I don't think it's a good idea. That's not correct. There's huge value in doing that sort of work, in establishing phenomena before we explain them. I truly believe that fitting models to data and then doing meta-analysis on this can establish robust phenomena that then can be explained in the second step. But I also believe we've done that for a few decades now in this field without much success. And so maybe it's time to think more about theory than description of data. So in the network literature, we usually take an interesting cross-sectional data set. We bake the data in the network model oven using a function in R, and then we interpret it to some degree. And again, I have the footnote here in this slide saying there's value in this because it's hypothesis generating. But at some point, we also need to move on. And we cannot just generate hypotheses for a decade and do nothing with it. And so I'm left wondering what this means. The same holds for the factor literature. What does it mean when people find 3 factors? Why do people use a factor model in the first place? It doesn't automatically apply. Like, you need to tell me why you're using a certain type of model. And I think the only difference to the network literature is that at this point, factor modelers have had about half a century of head start over us, and network modelers, but the problems are just the same. So here's a comment by a reviewer. The reviewer didn't sign their review. I don't know who that is, but I wanted to thank them greatly for this point. This is a review for an applied empirical network paper in clinical psychology I wrote maybe 3 years ago. The authors do not provide a compelling rationale for using network models. Can the authors show a substantial increment or special leverage offered by this network model? What theoretical or scientific questions is at stake here? I think that's a wonderful point, and it's very well taken. I fully agree with the reviewer that we didn't do that in that paper. But I, of course, also want to add the green color here for the factor models. Reading any factor modeling paper in psychology, you can probably raise the same questions. What is the substantial increment of the factor model here over principal components analysis or a sum score? What questions are at stake? What is the rationale for using a factor model, and so forth? So staying with factor models for a second, it's extremely rare to find a justification for the use of a factor model, like a substantive interpretation. Why do you use that model? What theoretical considerations or causal considerations guide you to use a structural equation model like a CFA? And this is not self-explanatory, because there are at least 2 core explanations or ideas why people use factor models. And we call that syntactical equivalence. Basically, you have a model and you can interpret the model causally in 2 different ways. First, that's the realist or causal explanation or interpretation, going back to Spearman, who said, well, the G factor exists and causes my data. So in this case here, these bubbles, the fears and so forth, are causal latent variables that cause observations. And the second interpretation is data summary. I'm going to disable my keyboard. Sorry for the pop-up there. Is agnostic to summarize your data. You can use factor models to summarize your data. And people do that sometimes. When I talk to researchers in that field, they often tell me that they use factor models to summarize their data. But when I read the papers these people write, I often get the interpretation that they have a causal idea about these constructs. And so that's sort of at odds in my reading of the literature, and I'm a bit confused by that. So for example, people often write, these are all direct quotes, I have references in the paper, they say, the latent variable explains the covariation of items. That's not a data summary if it explains. It directly influences the items, it underlies the items, it increases risk through the factor, through the latent variable, or it causally influences the items. So this is all very clearly causal and not agnostic. I call this a problem of latent theories rather than absent theories, because causality is often implied in the language authors use, but they don't have an introduction where they say, we believe the p-factor causes our items. It sort of just shines through between the lines, but it's not explicated as such. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. Ashley Watts, who wrote a nice review paper on the literature, also concludes that tacitly implied in much of the research is that the p-factor reflects a causal mechanism. I try to, so I'm a network modeler more than I'm a factor modeler. I use both, but I'm more known for the network stuff that I did. And so I try to be really hard on network models and network modelers in this paper as well. For this particular aspect, I don't have much to criticize the network literature for. So we're talking about latent theories now, because network modelers are often pretty clear that they have network theoretical causal ideas, which is why they use network models. This explication enables us to see whether the theoretical and statistical models map onto each other. And I already called out my colleagues for using DAGs, for example, these directed acyclic graphs, because they just don't follow, they don't map on network theoretical ideas of vicious cycles in data because your model doesn't allow for them. And so only when we explicate our theories can we corroborate or vet whether people's models make any sense to use for the processes that people want to recover from the data. Yep, so if theories don't help guide the selection of a model, of a statistical model, inferences become, at the very best, extremely difficult. So maybe briefly, I want to talk about the consequences this has had in psychology. And I think of this as having led to extremely weird baking recipes that people follow without thinking of what it does. So here's an example of a factor model with 5 items. You're an applied psychologist now, you're making a scale. You want to measure, I don't know, motivation, I don't know. And you give people, you say, okay, we have these 5 items that measure motivation. And you run a factor model on these items, you find that your scale is unidimensional, it's all very common, but you see that the first item has a very low factor loading. And so you say, well, I guess then I drop my item from the questionnaire and we're good. That's a very common process. You look at something like Chromos alpha, SPSS will tell you, if you drop item 1, your Chromos alpha will go up, you delete the item, you're good. But we don't think about theoretical processes that generate our data. So in the left case, so I take the right model, I simulate data from it, and I get the left statistical network model that has exactly the same fit to the data. So both of these models here that you see generate exactly the same covariance matrix. And then the left, I just have a causal process where X1 that I just deleted from my questionnaire is the trigger for all of the other items. So X1 causes X2, which causes X3, which then causes X4 and X5. And of course, we wouldn't want to delete X1 from our questionnaire. It's a really important question in the causal system that, yes, it has a weak influence on X2, but it is the start of a causal trigger, a chain reaction. So I see people deleting items left and right, but I wonder why we really do that. Why we use statistical techniques without being guided by theoretical inferences. I've asked this question in reviews a few times, like what's your theory to delete that item? And people just say, I don't know what you mean. So I wanted to write that up in the paper here. This is an actual example of a questionnaire that was used, I believe, in the 90s. It's an attachment questionnaire. Again, I do not want to call the author because the person was super cooperative. They shared tons of data with us. Without this person, we couldn't have written a paper on attachment and these sort of models. So thank you so much. But what this team of authors did is they fit an attachment a factor model to an attachment questionnaire, and they found that X10 has a cross-loading. It loads on two different factors. And the conclusion was really weird conclusion. Nobody in the world argues that there's just no theoretical justification for that. I don't understand why one would do that other than it looks bad on the screen. And yeah, I'm not going to go into more details here. I didn't in the paper. I also fit a network model on this, and I show that if you fit a network model on the data, item X10 is the central variable that connects the two clusters of nodes that go into Y1 and Y2. Of course, it just has to follow from equivalence. But I'm going to cut this short here. I just want to say that if you use these sort of models, I would love for you to tell me why you do something other than people have done it before and it improves my fit to the data. Okay, the third problem, weak theories. And I think weak theories are poor theories. And I think it's hard to have strong theories, but it's not impossible, and we should try to do better. So when I was a master's student, you can see a picture of me during my master's degree in the bottom right. That was quite some time ago. I tried to read up on the literature that understands depression as an adaptive evolutionary strategy. So the idea of being depressed gives you some fitness advantage. I was interested in that literature back then, 2009, 10. And so what I tried to do is I tried to write an agent-based model that would model this process of depression. And to see under which conditions in this agent-based model, where you have little agents that interact with each other, under which conditions depressed agents would have fitness advantages. So I needed, 25 parameters for the model. How large is the typical group in an evolutionary environment? How common are physical conflicts, because it matters for some of these theories? How do you win the encounter? How much resources are lost after defeat? When is the strategy of depression triggered after defeats? How long does it last? How effective is the strategy in communicating, and so forth and so forth. And I think here's the summary of me trying to find these parameters in the literature. Yeah, so I didn't find any of the theorists in the literature quantifying any of these parameters. And that means that the theories as they were proposed were untestable, unmodifiable, or if you are a Popperian and you think of the world as black and white, unfalsifiable by any evidence. It doesn't matter how the world looks like, these theories can just persist. And whether depression is adaptive or not depends entirely on the theorist, in this case me, and not the theory in, for example, the literature. And people often highlight the value of more formal theories, like in physics, because other people know what your theory predicts in detail without needing to call the theorist and say, hey, what do you mean with this? What is the relationship between A and B? You say they're related, but what is the relation, and so forth. And I think, one perk is that formal theories avoid the problem of being ambiguous. And I'll talk about this in a second. So, strong theories. Strong theories provide a precise set of non-ambiguous axioms or assumptions. 7 commentaries have been written on this paper. I link to those at the end of my slides. Some of them talk about the distinction here between axioms and assumptions. I'm not going to go into details here, but I find it quite interesting. Strong theories provide a clear explanation of a phenomenon, not just a description of data. Strong theories are, as I just explicated on the previous slide, independent of the theorists that propose them. A strong theory I can understand by reading your paper. I do not need to call you to ask about details. at least not about details of what you write about in your theory. Strong theories also enable actual testing of the theory in data. So in my case, for example, a precise network theory would give clear guidance what method to use in the data, and the method and the data combined would then enable me to update my theory, to corroborate, to reject, to modify my theory. We have a paper online as preprint that is a formalized model, a computational model of panic disorder, where we wrote about all the components that are in the model. This is just a summary, there are more. And all the processes, so all these arrows here are difference equations in a certain shape that is based on the literature on these relationships. If you're interested in this paper, I think it's a really, really nice example, and it's very applied. We've also taught a few workshops on this with Don Robino, who's the first author. So I think that's a nice summary why formal models are interesting and why we should do more of them in psychology. And there's more examples of good papers I will list in the end. This is something we've done. Strong theories also grant inference tickets. So if you have actual understanding of a system, like on the left side, we have a pretty good idea of where rain comes from and how much heat disperses and how much water evaporates and so forth. If you have a good understanding of a system, and strong theories help with this, it grants inference tickets, and that it tells you what would happen under a hypothetical intervention on the system. So going back here, for example, if this model works out well, and it corroborates data and so forth, it would allow us to find out what would happen under a certain intervention on the system without actually having to intervene on the system, which obviously is one of the most important things when we think about clinical psychology or the weather, where we want to intervene in a way that it avoids climate collapse, for example. So I'm going to skip this. I said that already. Yeah, I think I can conclude it here. So we gave a workshop about this, the importance of strong theories, and also how it improves psychological science, why it is crucial for open science to write out your theories in detail, that other people can corroborate and vet what you wrote and understand. The workshop is online here. And I want to go to the last part. It's very short, just 2 or 3 slides about the next decade. I think the next decade should be one of improving our theoretical practices, whereas the last decade focused on improving our statistical practices. That was important to establish more robust phenomena. The Psych Science Accelerator and other multi-lab pre-registered replication projects have certainly led to effects that are more trustworthy. I trust them more to exist as an effect, but I now want to know what they mean. I also want us to think more clearly about whether establishing an effect is interesting in the first place. One of the commentaries on my paper talks about this in more detail. Yeah, there are genuine benefits of stronger theories. I talked about this in some detail. Maybe a word about control. I talked about intervention before already, but if you have the wrong description of your data, for example, I could probably summarize the weather system here with factor models, and I might get 3 factors out of it. Doesn't tell you anything about control because it's a summary of your data rather than an understanding of the processes in your data. Control is also a nice way to disentangle statistical equivalence to get around the problem I talked about today. So in cross-sectional data, these 2 models are equivalent. I talked about that they have equal fit. But if you try to intervene on the system, if you intervene on X1, for example, here, if a network theory generates your data, you would expect other items to change as well. So if depression is a network of causally interacting variables, and you intervene on one of the variables like sad mood or insomnia, you would expect other items to also change as a consequence of that. But of course, in a factor model or in a common cause model, sorry, now I mixed up the models myself. If a common cause model generated your data, then intervening on one of the indicators of the latent variable will do nothing to the other variables, or at very minimal, will have very minimal impact because the variables are causally independent, conditioning on your latent variable or on your common cause. Here's a paper on the value of formal theories, again, led by Don Robino and Jonas Hasselbeck, which will be part of the special issue on theories in perspectives on Paul Mehl. I think that paper makes a few arguments very clearly that I missed out on today. And yeah, in the end, I think we need to allow data and models to help us update our theories. And I think we don't leverage that enough in psychology today. So there's a special issue coming out in Journal of Normal on theory. There's one in Perspectives coming out. There's tons of work just in the last 2 years, which was surprising to me when I set out to write this paper in 2016. There was so little work I could find in psychology, much more in philosophy of science, and now there's all this work in psychology. And I really recommend reading a couple of these core papers here. Yeah, I think it's just really important for all of us to work through this. For that reason, I put a reading list together with, I don't know, 15 or 20 papers I found most informative in the last 5 years, reading up on this sort of good introduction papers specifically for psychologists. I will update that list in a week or two to include some of the commentaries on my paper, which I found super insightful. Here are links to 5 of the 7 commentaries on my paper. That are all rejoinders. All of them agree in some capacity with my work and disagree in others. So they all raise really important points. And yeah, to finish this talk, given the recent work on this, maybe the conclusion should be that the theory glass is not half empty, but maybe half full in psychology. I'd like to thank a ton of people who have read the preprint and have been my office mates and my mentors and so forth. Some students of mine who have worked on this with me, and of course the HITOP consortium and the lab of Danny Borsbaum in Amsterdam for lots of stimulating discussions over the last few years. And you guys for paying attention for such a long time to somebody talking without interruptions. And to Hans for having me. And I think now would be a good time for a glass of water and questions.